Good evening, everybody. I'm Janet Neidhard, and we are happy to have you all here with us tonight on this beautiful night outside for our sixth event in our series called Multiplying Our Images of God, which has been co-sponsored by Bellarmine Chapel and the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice on Xavier University's campus. Before we jump into today's presentation, let me share a little bit of background on the series itself. The series was put together as part of our focus on active discipleship, and it's been coordinated by lay members of our social mission core team, the worship core team, and staff in collaboration with our theological partners at the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. Now, originally, we got together to discuss the need to multiply our images of God beyond the traditional masculine images like Father, King, and Lord, as are found in much of the Catholic prayer and liturgy. But as the team talked, we recognized that there were still bigger questions that we wanted to explore together to expand our own understanding of God. Our hope for the series has been that by multiplying our images of God, or rather by understanding how different traditions within and outside of Catholicism understand and talk about God using both human and more than human terms, that our individual and community life might be enriched. This lecture series isn't meant to make any particular proclamation about the nature of God, but rather to spur dialogue around these topics. Tonight is our final lecture, and we look forward to exploring where we will go with all of our new learnings in a mini retreat on April 2nd. Before I introduce tonight's first speaker, let me share a few logistics. You'll be kept on mute during the presentation. We have two pretty rich topics tonight since we're combining art and music. So we'll run till about 8:45, which is a little longer than usual. First, Kathy Stockman will walk us through historical images of the divine as reflected in visual arts. And then Scot Buzza will give us a deep dive from the musical perspective. In the interest of time, we will not have any breakout discussions, but we will make time at the end for some Q&A. If you have questions for either speaker, please type them into the chat, and those will go directly to Ashley and Donna on the steering committee, and they will collate the questions for our Q&A at the end of the evening. I will pose the questions to the speaker at that time. So now to introduce Kathy. Kathy Stockman is an art historian who has taught at a number of Ohio colleges and universities, including Miami University and the Cincinnati Art Academy. She currently teaches a series of art history classes at the Cincinnati Art Museum. Kathy, take it away.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited about sharing this with you, but I have to say, I'm a little nervous. I'm a little nervous about it, partly because all histories come with challenges, and whatever I choose to include in this presentation always comes with eliminating so many other things. So there's a slight chance you'll see some of your favorite religious works of art, but more likely you'll see things you've not seen before, and you probably won't even see your favorites. I know that I did not include my favorites, though I tried. I tried really hard to include some of my favorites. I was not able to. So, just so you know about that, these histories are very, very different. And so I want to start by, let's see if I can share this, make sure I'm sharing the right thing. There we go. There we go. So when we talk about art history and what I'm going to be doing, and I wanted to make sure you understood, I'm really going through the history of Western art more than any other cultures. So really my knowledge is in Western art. So that's what I'm going to be covering. Timer's on. So when we talk about Western art, again, some of these images you may be familiar with. So like the Venus of Willendorf, this is probably considered one of the oldest pieces of art that we know. You can see the date here, 24,000, 22,000 before the Common Era. So it's one of the earliest works of art we know, certainly the earliest sculpture. There are many of these. This is probably the one that's most famous, but there are so many of these. And the reason I start here is to introduce a problem with naming this object. We know this as the Venus of Willendorf, but the problem with that is we actually, just by naming this figure, we actually put our own cultural spin on this. There's nothing that tells us what this is. There's no writing that tells us what this is, how it was used, who made it. There's nothing that tells us. But for years, we've known this as a Venus figure, and there are many others. And collectively, we refer to them as Venus figurines. But of course, in doing that, applying that name as Venus, we run the risk of putting our own cultural spin on this object, a cultural spin that is very Western, that adopts a Roman mythology that was not happening at the time. And so I want to just pose that problem for us as we think about how we think about God and these images. So in trying to explain God, it's very natural for us to try to explain this. So it is important to critique this and looking at how or even why God is present in the visual arts may offer us a way into and out of tendencies that stifle our understanding of God, and maybe even our ability to love as God loves. So all of these images come, again, I want to stress, they come from a Western tradition. And so I want us to keep that in mind as we think about this. This has another relatively famous sculpture. It's an Aphrodite of Cnidus. And the reason I include this is because, and this is actually a Roman copy, this is a work of art that represents how Greek and Roman artists presented their gods as real, as people, as human. In fact, it wasn't just their mannerisms, which we see in their stories, but in their representation. So the goal of the artist for sculpting this is to make this as real looking as possible. So because their gods, these sculptures are supposed to embody each of these gods. And so the way this is done is by presenting the human body as naturalistically as possible. These are not portraits of anyone. No one has posed for these. This is really part of studying the human body and representing it in sculpture form. And part of that practice too is recognizing perhaps just the beauty that is in our own body, which can be prayerful. But what we see here too is this naturalism in the shape of the human body and the way she is posed. It's very, very relaxed. It's as she's just coming out of a bath. And there are stories that were written during this time that suggested that she was so real looking that people literally fell in love with her as if she was so real. So, and that was really the goal at this time, which makes it a particular problem for early Christian art. Early Christian art borrows from Roman and Greek traditions. And when we have those traditions that are trying to make their gods look real and natural, that becomes a problem for the church as they try to adopt some of these formal elements. The problem for artists come with these two philosophers who specifically asked if artists could actually be Christian because of what they're doing, because of what they're making. Because as we know from the commandments, we're not supposed to make images of God. We're just not allowed to do that. That goes against the commandments. And so, and then Augustine actually suggested that these images were lies, which meant artists are liars. So that makes it a real problem for the church, especially when we're trying to bring people to Catholicism. And the only way we can do that really is with images, because while the stories are oral, the teaching is very visual. And so there's a strict rule not to present images of God during this time. And so artists have to really try to figure out what to do, how to present. And so there are a couple of things that are done during this time. So we have the hand of God, which shows up in a lot of works of art during this time. This is a motif that represents God. So whenever you see this hand, especially in this pose, we're supposed to recognize this and read this as God. And what we notice here is that there's no body. It's just a hand. Sometimes it stops at the wrist, as we see here. Sometimes it's the arm along with the hand. And it's usually very gestured. But by seeing this, we understand this as being a representation of God. And this shows up time and time again in the earliest works of art. And I just wanted to give you some examples of how this presents itself, and perhaps you can see this, but we have the baptism of Jesus. And can you see my cursor? You can see it. Up here is the hand of God. We have the sacrifice of Isaac down here. And if you look closely, here's the hand of God. It's here to stop it. We have Moses getting the tablets, reaching up, and God's handing him the tablets here. And then I'm trying to remember what this is. I'm trying to remember which one this is. But we see God reaching here, God's hand here, but there's no image of God in these early pieces, because that is simply not allowed. We'll talk more about how the body is presented, even in these images. They're not naturalistic in any way, because again, that's part of the rule, is not to create any such images that look human. They're supposed to look more abstract. And so this idea of looking towards abstraction as a way to allude to God is the goal here. During the Middle Ages, for a long time, this was referred to as the Dark Ages. It's a phrase that you should not hear in any classroom anymore for a number of reasons. One is that it can be argued that there were a lot of really wonderful things happening during this time with science during this time, as well as the arts. I usually tell my students to recognize that this is probably the period, more than any other period in the history of art, that is about light. So calling it the Dark Ages is really a misnomer, because really the goal here is to capture light, and light is what's used as a symbol of God during this time. And it's done very, very successfully in many, many cathedrals, where if we look at any of these images, we see various different media that are exploring and capturing light and using it in the space. I did want to share this image. This is not an image that I usually see in art history, but it's usually associated with the maths and the sciences, but it's a very well-known image, God the Geometer, because God was oftentimes, during the Middle Ages, oftentimes associated with the sciences, particularly geometry and astronomy and astrology. And it was a big link. So this is a really wonderful image of God creating the earth using a compass, which is, again, back in the 1200s. So it's hopefully this seems a bit enlightening to a lot of us, because I know many people like to think of this period as a period where nothing happens. And pictures show us and science shows us that there's so much that happens here. The Basilica or the Abbey of Saint Denis is probably one of the most important Romanesque cathedrals that we know, partly because this abbey really set the tone for the Romanesque and Gothic era. And the goal here too is to try to make this space as filled with God as possible, without the use of sculptural images of God. That's not to say there aren't images in these churches, but creating this cathedral, it was meant to give you a sense of awe when you walk in. So with the use of stained glass windows, with the use of mosaics, and what you can see here is the way the light plays all over the place, all over the walls, against the various different color marbles, coming in through the various different color windows, as well as many mosaics that you may see on the walls. All of these are supposed to fill you with a sense of God's presence. And so if any of you have been into a cathedral, any cathedral, chances are you experience this sense of awe and as you walk in, whether it's your first time or your 100th time going in. I don't know about you, but every time I walk into a cathedral, I feel the same way. And it's for this reason. And as the abbot said, all you seek to honor these doors, marvel not at the gold and the cost, but at the art. The noble work is bright, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten minds, allowing them to travel through the lights to the true light where Christ is, the true door. And so that is the goal, is to really see God in this space through color and through light. That's not to say there weren't any sculptural works in Gothic cathedrals and Romanesque cathedrals. Perhaps the most prominent sculptural reliefs we see on in these old churches are on the tympanum, over the royal portal, or over any portal. And perhaps the most famous one, the most famous image that you will find is the Last Judgment. That's what you'll see over the royal portal, over many of these cathedrals. This one is considered one of the largest. And the reason for this, this subject to be here was really to encourage people to come to the church. Many of these cathedrals, they were designed, as large as they were, for pilgrims and for pilgrimages. And so the hope is that the people who are coming in, they come and they see this image, which is actually kind of frightening, where you see both heaven and hell in the image. You see in certain sections, you see people's souls being weighed to determine if they can go to heaven or not. You have, and then of course you have Christ in the center, who is in a mandala, or this almond-shaped space that's supposed to represent the heavens. This gives God this kind of heavenly space that is separate from our own. And so the mandala, or this almond-shaped space, is very, very common as a way to keep this figure in a space above ours. And looking closely, you will see angels on all sides, actually lifting this mandala up as if it's very, very heavy. So again, these sculptural pieces are actually, and for many people who come in, maybe the first images you see of before coming into the chapel. And the whole idea is really to, I guess, kind of to scare you into becoming Catholic, because we really want to recruit as many, and that's how we do it. We recruit people from pagan religions to the Catholic religion, by letting them know that only through these doors can they get to heaven. And that's what these images are meant to do. Another image that shows up quite a bit early in Christianity is Mary. Mary shows up a lot more, probably more than any other figure. She's very her story is known well. She's honored by many, partly because she's more closely linked to us as being human, as an intercessor. There are many, many images of her because she does come with many titles, but perhaps one of the most well-known ways of representing her, besides the Annunciation, which we see many of those, we see her here enthroned, her being on a throne, here with saints, as well as angels. If you look up, God's hand is here too, shows up here. But she is sitting on a throne, which puts her above the saints. But she also functions as a throne. So not only is she in a throne, but she functions as a throne for the Son of God. And so Jesus is almost always on her lap. And oftentimes she gestures towards him as a way of sort of pointing the way, that he is the way. And so she functions as that throne of God. And we see again, very kind of an abstract depiction of her. There's, you can sort of see where her knees are bent here. So there's a little bit of three-dimensionality here, but her feet, for instance, one points down, the other one points away, which kind of gives us a hint or kind of a sense of three-dimensionality, or maybe an earthiness, but still, it's still much more abstract and flattened out. So even the space itself is pretty flat. As you can see, there was some layering in this painting, where the angels, you can tell, your eye should read this as not the angels necessarily being taller than the saints, but they're standing behind the saints. So there is an interest in creating a sense of natural depth that is somewhat earth, puts us here on earth. And I think that gives us an idea of, where she is. She is human, and she is close to us. So, and that's one of the reasons why we see her in this way. So when we talk about Renaissance art is probably one of the most popular, and this is a period of time when figures the Renaissance actually is about bringing back the images that and the styles and the forms that are well known from ancient Greece and Rome. And we see them show up in the sciences, we see them show up in a very big way in the arts. And so during this period, really the phrase that is perhaps most popular and most quoted during this time is, "Man is the measure of all things." That is the phrase for the Renaissance. Man is the measure of all things. So now we're going back to imagining God as man. And here in this creation of Adam by Michelangelo, which is in the Sistine Chapel, you see God in what looks like a cloud, but perhaps a cape, surrounded by angels, reaching out to create Adam. And what he does, his body actually mirrors Adam, which really, and I'll bring it back again, but what we see, the interest in doing that is to show this humanism in God's, a humanism that we have not seen since Roman times. But this becomes pretty crucial now, especially as we start thinking about attracting more people to the church and really teaching these stories. And so God and Mary and Jesus become more human. But not only that, they become beautiful humans, very muscular. We know more about the human body during this time. And so that is presented in images of God quite often during this time. We see the same thing happening with Madonna. The Virgin Mary looks much more human. In fact, many of the paintings about her or of her now have her more interacting with Jesus. And this is, of course, Madonna del Prado, or Madonna of the Meadows. This is perhaps Raphael's most famous of his Madonna paintings. He was actually well known for doing Madonna paintings. In fact, that's how he got his commission for at the Vatican for the papal apartments for these paintings. What he does here, he actually models his work after Leonardo da Vinci, who uses a triangle as a way to stabilize the picture plane, as a way to stabilize them, the three of them. Also, there's this landscape in the background that again gives it this depth that an enthroned Madonna cannot provide, but it seems so she's literally here on earth with us. So there's no hint of a heavenly space unless we read the sky that way, but she is grounded here on earth, just as Jesus and John the Baptist are here. They look very, very naturalistic. There is a symbol here, a couple of symbols that I wanted to point out to you briefly. You'll notice the cross here and the staff, and then back here are roses, which represent the passion of Christ. Any red flowers you see represent the passion of Christ. And this helps us and helps readers of the visual arts to understand what is happening here. This is how they recognize her to be who she is, and not just a woman with two babies. We recognize her as a Madonna based on these images, these symbols that are here, and that helps teach this story to many followers who are not reading the Bible simply because they cannot read. So they use these symbols, they use these paintings to understand to understand the stories, and to be able to recognize them for who they are. So the Council of Trent put some decrees out that supports the ideas that images that need to be educational. See, there was a problem during the Renaissance, a concern that all of these images of God, Jesus, Mary, they were all being idolized. They were all so beautiful. People wanting to touch them, people wanting to pray to them. And the Council of Trent, in response to the Reformation, made some decisions as to what kind of art can be allowed in the church as a way to combat the Reformation. So the way to counter that, it was really important to make sure that people were not simply idolizing these statues and simply loving them for their beauty, but they had to be engaged in the story. They had to know that. And so while the Council of Trent didn't actually tell artists exactly what they had to do or how to paint or how to sculpt, they did make some rules as to what they were going to commission. So they did require a new sense of naturalism, which meant instead of a beautiful body coming down off the cross, laying on Mary's lap, if that body's dead, Jesus's body needs to look like it's dead. That cannot be a beautiful figure, has to look as natural as possible. So the figures, all of the figures you see need to be natural as possible. The stories have to be theatrical as a way to engage, not just icons to be prayed with, but stories that engage the viewer and in some ways invite them in. And what was welcomed were conversion stories. Conversion stories, callings, ecstasies, these were all important stories that invited the viewer to recognize themselves in these people. So if tax collectors can be called, maybe you can be called. And so we're going to tell these stories and show these images of people being called into the church. And it's much more engaging. It's not meant to be prayed for, but to actually understand the story and be part of it. And perhaps one of the best artists to do this was Caravaggio. And the Calling of St. Matthew is probably the best example of this. In this calling, we have Jesus off to your right, up here, actually pointing to Matthew, who then asks, who, me? He's just a tax collector. And you actually see him with money. There's money in his hat. And yet he is being called. Caravaggio uses these wonderful ways of capturing the viewer's eye by using light, just as what was done in early Christian works, using this way of light so you can follow it. So it's not just Jesus' finger, you're actually following this line of sight that takes you to Matthew. What we see too in a lot of Caravaggio's works is that many of the, some of the clothing that you see that they're wearing is pretty contemporary. The figures that you see here in almost all of his paintings, these are models. He's actually one of the first artists to paint from models. And he does this as a way to capture this realism. So he's actually painting real people. So it's not just his imagination of what is beautiful. These people are modeling for him, and he does a painting of them. Many of them are even known to his audience. People know who they are. He'll use them over and over again, which really adds to that ability to engage the viewer. They know who this person is. Perhaps they are part of this story, and as a calling, this can be a wonderful conversion story, not only for Matthew, but for the viewer. As they look at this painting. And there are some elements too in Caravaggio's work that indicate a realism. You can't see it here, but many of his works have where all of his figures, if you look very, very closely, you can see their fingernails are all dirty fingernails. And again, that's just an element to make it as natural as possible. But these are just everyday people. There's nothing incredibly special about their everyday people that Jesus calls to follow him. I wanted to do a detail of this hand. This is Jesus' hand from the last painting. And then this is the creation of Adam detail. And what we see here is, I always like to point this out because it always fascinates me. Jesus' hand, if you look, it looks a lot like Adam's hand. It's almost exactly like Adam's hand here, only it's facing in the direction, it's the direction of God's hand. This is intentional. This is Caravaggio, of course, he knows Michelangelo's painting, and what he does here is by creating this hand of a man, of Adam, in the same direction, taking the space or sharing the space with God's hand, we are able to recognize Jesus as both divine and human. And that is one little strategy that Caravaggio does, and he adopts Michelangelo's hand to do that. So I always find that really fascinating that he's able to do that. And there are many artists who do things like that. In fact, I usually ask my students, whenever they're looking at paintings or sculptures, just look at the hands, because you never know, you may see Adam's hand there. There are a lot of artists who do it. Another conversion is the conversion of St. Paul. Caravaggio did a couple of these. This one happens to be my favorite of the two, partly because of the way or the perspective we're seeing this from. This is just as Paul falls off the horse, as if he's spilling in our space. And we see again this very dark background and the light shining on Paul's face. And this is the moment of conversion. And by having Paul kind of, we're watching it from this angle, it's almost as if Paul shares our space, and that we can be converted, and we are welcomed, and we are being welcomed in to the painting. Other painterly ways this is done is through diagonals, rather than strict horizontals that you may be familiar with The Last Supper by Leonardo, where the table actually separates you from Jesus. Here, with all of these wonderful diagonals that make up the painting, it ends up being much more engaging, and you're in many ways invited into the painting. And that's the way Caravaggio works, is to bring you in. And this is why he was sought out by the church quite often. And his paintings were actually created, this hung, if I'm trying to remember, it hung at an altar. And so if you were to walk up to it, you would actually be just below. So you would be at eye level. You would share the same space as Paul here. And then I have to show you the ecstasy of St. Teresa, because this is perhaps one of the most, probably one of my favorite conversion stories, partly because I love Bernini's work. Bernini is a sculptor. He's actually a multimedia artist. Everything in the Coronaro Chapel he created. This is St. Teresa. This story actually comes from her own writings. So it's her telling the story of her conversion, this moment of her ecstasy, and Bernini depicts it here. And again, with these wonderful diagonals, he uses real light here. So while we have these golden rods coming down here, he also uses, there's a window at the top that actually shines real light. So really, God is present in this space through that light and in this story. And it becomes incredibly engaging that way. I wanted to just spend a little bit of time, not much, a little bit of time with a Dutch artist, because I don't want you to think that during the Reformation, there was no religious art in Protestant communities. There were many religious pieces. They were usually presented as with lots of symbols and usually telling stories that are not necessarily biblical, but they're meant to be like lessons in morality. So women holding a balance is interpreted as a vanitas painting, as represented and represents divine truth and justice. Some read this as her weighing her jewels. And then if we look, which I can't get much closer, but the painting behind her is the final judgment. And so many read this painting by Vermeer as really thinking about what is most important, especially if you're thinking about going to heaven. And so weighing that out, and that's what's in the balance here. So thinking about leading a balanced life. And so Vermeer does a number of paintings like this. Vermeer was actually brought up Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism. And so many of his paintings included a number of religious imagery. This allegory of the Catholic faith is probably one of the most fascinating ones for me, because it's filled with a number of symbols. This is thought to be a hidden or private chapel in someone's home, which were very common at the time, because practicing Catholicism was not permitted. So this would be a hidden chapel in a home. The painting in the back, we see this woman here. She's supposed to represent the church. What she sits next to is an altar. There's a chalice there, a crucifix there. She is stepping on a serpent there. So, and that would be evil, stepping on evil. And then behind her is the crucifixion. That's behind her. While she represents the church, what we know from this painting is that she seems to obscure, just from where she's sitting, she seems to obscure Mary Magdalene, who is in the painting behind her, which makes some people think that perhaps while she's the church, she is perhaps Mary Magdalene as well, which is a really wonderful overlap in thinking about who we are as the church, as penitent sinners. This tapestry here is a common element that was used to hide chapels. And also Vermeer used curtains quite a bit to kind of drawn curtains as a way to open up the scene and draw the scene. It's hard to see the images in the tapestry, but some have suggested that, well, we at the very least, we see a man leading either a horse or a mule. And if that's the case, it's not difficult to imagine perhaps this tapestry depicts a picture of the Holy Family fleeing Jerusalem, which would be fitting as well. And I'm only bringing this comparison because I couldn't help but think about both of these, with her foot on a globe and God and his compass. They seem to match in some way. So I wanted to just present that as a comparison. I really couldn't finish this talk without inviting you to come with me to talk about some abstract art and the ability to find divine in abstract art. And perhaps the easiest way to find it is in Mark Rothko's color field paintings, partly because Mark Rothko's works were works in color, and he was very interested in the command and the feelings that color evoke in us. His paintings are absolutely enormous. So they're larger than you are. So if you stand in front of it, it's much larger than you. And his goal was to bring you in and have you be part of this painting. And this space is your space. And while he has a number of them, I wanted to show number 61 because there are 3 fields of color here. And some people read this as a very abstracted image of the human body, which is hard to see unless you're standing in front of it. So once you stand in front of it, it's like the head, the torso, and the legs. And so the idea of thinking about being in that space. And so it's as if it models you in that space. But he worked very hard to create this kind of spirituality in his work. And he saw in color a real way to find spirituality, to find God. It became so important to him. There is the Rothko Chapel in Houston. If you ever get a chance if you ever go to Houston, please stop here. It's a beautiful, beautiful chapel. Very, very different from our Gothic or Romanesque cathedrals. Not a lot of light and color. There are a number of paintings inside, and you're just welcome to go in, pray, write, sit, and it's a very, very peaceful place where you are in this space that Rothko creates for you. And it is no matter how many people are in the space with you, it's very peaceful, and it really does it called me to prayer right away, just being in that space. So perhaps the sense of awe I get from a Gothic cathedral with all the light and with all the beautiful stained glass windows, I get that same thing here at the Rothko Chapel. I really do. And I'm going to end with Barnett Newman's 1 Mint. This painting he is considered another color field painter. However, he kind of bridges the color field painters or the painters that paint a canvas one color with the abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock, who do a lot of splashes and very gestural paintings. And the reason he bridges them is because while this is one big canvas with a color, that line is done with a single gesture. He paints that line. And these show up in a number of his paintings. He refers to them as zips, and they show up. And the reason I wanted to end with this one is because it's really interesting when we think about this stroke. This zip is often read as that single artist stroke, that first stroke of creativity, that first line of creating something that could be compared with creation, any creation, the first line. Some also see this zip as the moment when God says, let there be light, and that's it. That zip is the light. That's the moment. And so taking us back to the hand of God, and thinking about how God creates, I wanted to just be sure that I just wanted to invite you to think about the possibility of how artists as creators also think about their shared existence with God, no matter what they believe, that in each of their works, there is this thing about creating what is beautiful and what is spiritual. And we see that in many of these works. So.
Wow. Thank you, Kathy.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
so much. Yeah.
Welcome. I just have to stop sharing.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Yeah. I think, yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Okay. Well, we're ready now to move on to music. And a quick introduction of Scot Buzza. Dr. Scot Buzza has performed all over the world, and he's held principal violist positions with orchestras in both Tokyo, Japan, and Barcelona, Spain. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he held simultaneous fellowships in both the School of Music and the Department of Slavic Languages and Linguistics, and of the University of Kentucky, where he earned his PhD in musicology with a focus on 18th century Venetian sacred music. Locally, Scot Buzza has taught at CCM and XU, and he currently teaches music theory, aural skills, and music history in the School of the Arts at Northern Kentucky University. So Scott, it's all yours.
Okay, terrific. Good. I am juggling a couple of browser windows here, so hopefully I'm going to do this in a way that doesn't result in chaos. So I'm going to jump to screen share right away. And I'm going to see if I can get away with, the button that I need is under there. Let's see here. How do I can close that? Go up. There we go. From current slide. Terrific. Okay, mission accomplished, and it with a minimum of bloodshed. Okay, terrific. Here. So, I'm going to present this information in a little bit of an odd order, but there is a logic to it, which will make sense when the pieces start to come together. So we're talking about images of God, specifically in Mozart's Requiem. So we have to fill in two little areas first. Before we can talk about Mozart's Requiem, we have to talk about Mozart. Before we can talk about Mozart, we have to talk about the Requiem Mass in general and about the Roman Catholic Mass in particular. So, because most of us are Roman Catholics, we don't have to belabor this too much, but some of these points come back later. So it's worth talking about a few things right now. First of all, in general, broad terms, the function of the Roman Catholic Mass, to educate and to commemorate, right? when we say educate, we're talking about teaching lessons in Christianity, the idea of salvation, and damnation, if the case may be, through Jesus's crucifixion, resurrection, ascension into heaven. And then commemoration, specifically commemorating the big high points of salvation history, mostly centered on commemoration of the Last Supper. So if you think about the formulation of the Mass, the first half is learning stuff through readings and a homily. The second half is commemorating the Last Supper through the Eucharistic rite, right? So in worship, one of the primary vehicles for doing that is the texts. The prayers that are sung or spoken, whether they're ones that are formulaic and the same every week, or that are specific to a specific to that day, or the spontaneous ones, right? Music, in the context of liturgy, is the medium for the words. It accompanies the ritual, it inspires the assembly, and then does that magic thing where it combines with all of our other senses to produce an experience which is greater than the sum of its parts, something that's sometimes referred to as transcendence. Kathy, I was this close to using the statue of the sculpture of Saint Teresa, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, to demonstrate this, and I opted for light streaming through windows instead. But this idea that music can do something that words can't. It can heighten the way that our visceral responds to it, right? Which is why we mess with it in liturgy to begin with. So that's true of any Roman Catholic Mass. A Requiem Mass specifically, of course, is a Mass for the dead. It's offered for the repose of a specific deceased person. The term Requiem, from the very first prayer in Latin, Requiem aeternam donis ei Domine, which is where the term Requiem comes from, refers to the texts, this complete set of prayers, psalms, you have it, that are spoken or recited, or in this case, sung, when we're doing a commemorative Mass for the dead. So, for many, many centuries, the Requiem Mass was chanted along with everything else during the Mass to the melodies of Gregorian chants. Somewhere in the 1500s, musicians started replacing the chant with their own musical compositions. Little by little, instead of just a cappella unaccompanied chant, many of those musicians started including instruments along with a full range of singers. In places like Venice, which happens to be the focus of my research, if you had any money in the family coffers at all, you can bet that when Grandpa died, you were going to hire a full orchestra, a full chorus of professional singers, hire a composer to write an entire Mass for you, and then pay tons of money to have it performed, because after all, it's for the repose of Grandpa's soul. So the Requiem kind of refers to a genre. There are still requiems that are composed today by modern day composers in literally every musical genre that you can think of. The current number is over 2,000 easily into the 21st century. Okay, so because this musical template follows the pre-Vatican II template, the names of the movements, the individual sections of a Requiem Mass when it's set to music, follow that template as well. This is just a quick eye view. The blue stuff is the stuff that's sung by a choir. The burgundy colored stuff is stuff that would be chanted probably by the presider, and then the orange parts are things that would be spoken during it. So if you're Mozart and you're going to write a Requiem, this is the template that you've got to work from. These are the boxes you have to check. Okay? So there we go, Requiem 101. I'm going to switch gears for a second, talk about Mozart. This was a family photo that was made during their lifetime. It kind of points to a lot of truths about the family. You can see there's Mozart looking not very happy. They didn't smile in this period. The father, Leopold, the mom who had passed away, but there she is in the family photo as a portrait, and his sister, Anna Maria, who was also a very talented composer and performer, who once she began to hit puberty was just yanked out of the limelight and told to go off and get married to somebody and have a bunch of kids. So Mozart, there is so much myth and what's the nice word? There's just a lot of baggage. There's a lot of fluff surrounding Mozart's life history, surrounding his work. It tends to show up in superlatives that aren't necessarily very helpful. If you just Google Mozart books, these were the first 4 titles that came up. The Genius of Mozart, A Miracle of Nature, Mozart, the First Romantic, the best composer of all time, the greatest composer ever. That's problematic. Being the greatest whatever ever is an impossible statement to defend, right? In the same way that we tend to sort of conflate people and things and their work and their life stories into superlatives, we tend to romanticize all sorts of details. In the case of Mozart, surrounding his Requiem, there is a ton of baggage in the form of myths that showed up pretty much immediately after his death. Here's some hard and fast, sort of quick Mozart 101. So Mozart was indeed born a child prodigy. He was indeed a brilliant, brilliant musician, born in Salzburg, Austria. At the time he was born in Salzburg, Austria, Salzburg was not Austria. Salzburg was Salzburg, Germany was Germany, and Austria was Austria. That's important to Mozart because the town, the province, was ruled by a bishop prince, meaning he was the archbishop, he had control over everybody's souls, and he was the prince, so he had control over everybody's finances. He controlled both state and ecclesiastical power. That's great if you get along with your employer. Mozart didn't. As a child prodigy, he kind of, like if you think of child actors nowadays that end up in rehab at age 15, he was maybe one step away from going down that road. He had a huge effect as a child prodigy and then had a hard time being taken seriously as an adult musician. He had been an international celebrity as a kid, and when it came time to enter the workforce as a full-time professional musician, that didn't go so well. Musicians were treated like servants during this period, and he didn't do well with that particular adjustment. So he took a risk. At age 25, he broke ties with the bishop that employed him. He broke ties with his family, left Salzburg, became a freelance musician in Vienna. There was no template for being a freelance anything in Vienna at this point. It's not as if people knew how to suddenly become a businessman on their own behalf after having been an artist who had housing and a food allowance and free reign to do what they wanted. His first years went really well. His last years did not go so well. In the very last year of his life, 1791, as Napoleon is ravaging Italy, Mozart's off in Vienna. His finances are growing desperate. His health is getting worse by the day, and he gets visited by a stranger, somebody literally dressed in a, costume, disguising their identity intentionally, dressed in solid black or solid gray, depending, carrying an anonymous letter saying, hey, we want to commission a musical setting of a Requiem. We're going to pay you X amount of money, and on such and such date, you're going to deliver us the printed, finished score, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, it turns out we now know, Mozart did not know, but we now know that this was a nobleman who had a habit of commissioning pieces of music from very good composers anonymously, and then putting his name on them and passing them off as his own. That's exactly what he intended to do with Mozart's Requiem once he got it into his hands. As Mozart's health got worse, he started to believe that his Requiem that he was writing for this nobleman was actually for his own death. He started to perceive this as some sort of supernatural sign from God, and struggled to finish it while he was on his deathbed. He died right before his 36th birthday. He did not finish the Requiem, so it was quietly completed by a couple of his students. His wife, after all, had debts to pay. She needed the commission. She delivered the score to the nobleman, and everybody quietly forgot about it, except very quickly, the public discovered this piece, knew that it was Mozart, and it became a staple, an absolute cornerstone of Western sacred music and a major masterpiece. So those two pieces, Requiem Mass and Mozart, are the two that we're putting together. And the goal is just to ask the open question, what does, this isn't the question on the screen, we're asking the question, what can putting Mozart's Requiem under the microscope tell us about piety, about Mozart's and his contemporaries' views of spirituality in the 18th century, and then hold that mirror up to ourselves really briefly if we have time to say, what does it tell us about our own, okay? I'm going to back up a step and go to a more superficial question, which is, what does sacred music like Mozart's Requiem have in common with stained glass windows and other religious iconography? Well, okay, take a look at the stained glass window. If you know the code, and if you understand the symbols, you can say, oh, this is Saint such and such who's being persecuted. He was the bishop of such and such, and this is this story where this is happening. This was your catechism. In an illiterate society where any sort of formal education was hard to come by, your religious education came from what you heard at Mass, but it also came from the decorations around the church, the stained glass windows, that kind of functioned the same way that comic books might function now. It came from the music. In overt ways, the things that you sang, and in covert ways, in ways that you were told how to feel about the words you were hearing. And so the point of that is Mozart's connection of text to the music was intended to tell the listener, first of all, to reinforce basic spiritual ideas, but also to very much reinforce fundamental ideas of the Catholic catechism. So when we talk about connecting the text to the music or representing text in music, there's a nice word for this. It's called text painting or painting in text, sometimes word painting. What that means is that all of the choices that a composer has when they create a piece of music from scratch can be used as expressive tools to highlight certain aspects of the text, either overtly or in more subtle ways that we might clue into subconsciously but not overtly realize. The way that a composer might use his choice of keys, tonality, is it major or is it minor? His tempo, is it fast, is it slow, is it medium, is it heavy, is it ponderous, is it lively, is it happy, the character of the music. The instrumentation is a big one, especially if you're writing a piece for chorus with a full orchestra, because you've got a box of 69 crayons in the form of the orchestra, right? Voicing, which voices are singing which parts and when and in what part of their range. How do you use your text? Which words do you repeat? Which words do you glide over really quickly and kind of brush under the rug? Which words do you repeat over and over and over and over because you don't want people to miss them? You can take a simple sentence, the dog and the cat ran into the yard, and choose to repeat one of those words to emphasize whatever it is that you want. The dog and the cat, the dog ran into the yard, right? It's clear that I'm emphasizing the dog. The dog ran into the yard. The yard is where the cat and the dog ran. You can mess with it, as any composer does, to highlight what you want to highlight. And then things like dynamic contrast, how loud everybody sings and plays, how quietly they sing and play, and all of the other stuff that they do in the meantime. Here is a link. We're not going to watch this video right now. It's there in case you want to take a look at the PowerPoint afterward. It's a cool little 5-minute snippet from the 1980s movie Amadeus, which is mostly fiction, disclaimer, but which does a really good job of talking about some basic truths behind it. There's a scene where Mozart is making conscious choices about how to set the Requiem text to music, and he's dictating it on his deathbed. And it's just a cool little illustration of he might have chosen this or he might have chosen this, but no, he chose this. Okay, we're going to look at those choices to see what that tells us. So what does the study of Mozart's Requiem tell us about ideas of God in the afterlife in 18th and 19th centuries in Catholic Europe? And what does an examination of those ideas reveal about our own ideas in the 21st century? So rather than me playing clips of music and telling you what to see and hear, I've chosen a really different approach with this because I don't want to claim to have all the answers, and everything that we're talking about is highly subjective. So I give this as an assignment often in my history classes. And over the past several years, I've been collecting student responses. And what I've done here is I've picked my 20 favorite student responses of things that students have picked out of the music, identified that they think gives them some sort of insight into Mozart's spirituality and the spirituality of his period. The actual assignment was for them to just view a concert recording of the Requiem, provide points of text painting, and explain what it means and how Mozart represents it in the music. So, again, disclaimer, this is highly subjective. Did Mozart intend most of this to be perceived that way? Absolutely. Did everybody in the world who heard it perceive it that way? No, not necessarily. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. This is the part where I do some juggling of browser windows. We've got 20 short little snippets of bits from Mozart's Requiem, along with the text and along with students' perceptions of them. Okay, so the first one, the student said at the 5-minute 40 mark, when the lines "Hear my prayer, grant them eternal rest, Lord," are sung by the chorus, the pitch increases. I think just the fact that these lyrics were sung by many people together and not just by one has a lot of meaning within itself. It also seemed as if the voices have some sort of desperation and intensity. It was as if they needed God to hear those words in that prayer. I think Mozart did this on purpose. So see if you hear that in this snippet. So there's the intensity that you can hear in that. Okay, next one. For example, at the 6-minute, 10-second mark in the video, they're singing the line, "And let perpetual light shine on them." Hold on. I didn't intend for that to happen. Let me go back. So let perpetual light shine on them. The music becomes brighter and switches to a major key. It has a very graceful kind of melody to emphasize the eternal light shining on the deceased. And here's that. There's a grace, there's kind of a gracefulness to that you can hear. This student said at 6:45 you hear a sequence of music. I keep meaning not to do that. Okay, technology's winning. At 6:45 you hear a sequence of music that has a new texture between the choir and solo soprano. The words, "O God, you shall have praise in Zion, homage shall be paid to you in Jerusalem." She said, "This section reminds me of the paintings of angels." It's going to try to play. I'm going to stop it if I can. No, maybe we're okay. So next one. 7:16, the phrase "Hear my prayer" is suddenly sung by the entire choir, making it impossible to miss. The character at this time is somewhat longing. This part of the piece could be seen to represent the mourning experience by those still left behind on earth. Here we go. There we go. At 9:23, Lord have mercy on us, Christ have mercy on us, Lord have mercy. The music is desperate, as if he's crying out in desperation. The pitch gets lower and higher, lyrics being sung against each other. The mood changes from hopeful to sad to gloomy over a short period. The anxiety seems to never end until everyone shouts together, Lord have mercy, at the end. So you can hear they're literally just singing over each other. At 11:23, these lyrics, Lord have mercy, are very dragged out and sung in unison, therefore adding emphasis and urgency to him. She's talking about the ritardando at the end of the Kyrie, where the music slows down as if somebody puts on the brakes. And silence. That's not what I want. Okay, at 11:34, the music doesn't just pause right where we stopped. It just lurches forward. It launches forward into the most terrifying part of the Requiem. On that day of wrath, the world shall be reduced to ashes. This is also the loudest part in the Requiem. So the drama in there is pretty unmissable. At 12:26, the words cuncta stricte discussuras in Latin are super punctuated on each syllable to highlight the stern, angry way that God is going to judge us. That was really quick. It goes by really quick. The great trembling there will be great trembling there will be referring to the end of the world and the world dissolving in ashes, right? The whole bass part of the orchestra is rocking back and forth between those two notes in unison, because the ground will be rocking and trembling beneath their feet as the world dissolves into ashes. It's going to sound like this. Do, 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 except it's in the bass part of the orchestra, so that you're literally feeling it through your whole body. The next two, I'm going to show you the slides first, and then you will listen to what I'm talking about. So at 1334, I love this comment. I love this kid. The text reads, "The wondrous sound of the trumpet," referring to the Last Judgment, but the solo instrument is a trombone. And I thought that was very interesting. Like, it's going to be a big, big trumpet, not a tiny human trumpet, so big it plays in the bass range. The bass soloist sings really low notes to match. And then at 1423, the tenor soloist surprises us and interrupts the bass to sing about something completely different in a different tempo and in a different key. He sings about surprise as in, "Death and nature shall be stunned when mankind arises." That. There's the interruption. Singing, interrupting to sing about how surprised everybody's going to be by surprising everybody. At 1640 in the video and ending around 1720, during this part of the Requiem, notice how the words king, rex in Latin they sing, are sung very loudly and with some kind of urgency. King of all powerful majesty. The orchestra is majestic. Oops. At 18 minutes, it sounds like begging or groveling from the choir. Salva me, save me. where it suddenly gets quiet and they sing a descending line of 3 notes, "Save me, fount of mercy." Here we go. Those are the 3 descending notes. Okay. At 20:54, I noticed in this part of the piece when they say, "Righteous judge of vengeance, grant the gift of forgiveness before that day of reckoning." This part talks about how one knows that they are wrong and they are begging God for forgiveness. These lines are sung at a higher pitch, almost like a little child would beg, "Please." The harmony gets threatening whenever they sing about the day of reckoning. So that's a pretty pronounced change to the music that came before it. At 23:10, the line, "Let me not burn in eternal fire," is sung. During this phrase, the entire pitch, rhythm, melody, and dynamic changed and increased. The orchestra is in unison for emphasis. If you notice, anytime the piece refers to flames, fire, or burning, most likely referring to hell, the music becomes overly intense. Oh, I'm gonna really have trouble with this. I might have to do this the hard way. So that's the reference to hell. Okay. 24:20, the Confutatis has huge contrasts and drama. Many parts of Mozart's Requiem are fire and brimstone. The beginning says, "When the accused are confounded and doomed to flames of woe, call me among the blessed." It starts out strong, powerful, and tragic, sung entirely by the soloists. On "Call Me to Join the Blessed," the women all sound like innocent kids and the instruments change from a minor key to gentler music. Let's see here. That's the transition right there. And then we're back to the fire music after the innocent child music. At 26:40, the text mentions tears and mourning, so that the music is quite calm and soft. The music in the violins is the 2-note sigh motive. I'll come back to that in a second. "That day shall be a day of weeping," is the text. The music rises up on, "From the ashes shall arise," in another example of text painting. In the same way that I mentioned, if you looked at a stained glass window and you knew the code, you knew the symbolism, you would know what you were supposed to be seeing. If you are familiar with music in this period and you're just a general person who goes to church, you know that anytime you hear 2 notes together where one note is higher than the other, bottom, bottom, that's supposed to represent a sigh or weeping. And so it's called a sigh motive because it's extremely common. And that's the 2-note sigh motive. And they're singing about weeping. The music rises, and they're singing about rising from ashes. Good. Two more. At 27:29, the singers sing the lyric, "Have mercy on them, God, gentle Lord Jesus." And they sing this suddenly gently and pianissimo. Here it comes. Now we missed it. Let me back up. There it is. And one last one. 39:20, this part, the Benedictus, meaning blessed, carries more of a lighthearted tone as it is in a major key and more happy. Since it's toward the end of the Requiem, I assume that it was meant to reflect the joyous parts of death, no longer being in pain and having a new beginning in a different life. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Close up. Whoa, really different in character, like nothing that came before. So he's making an absolute point of not ending on the dreary parts of it, but on the hopeful part of it, right? So the most savvy comment that I've had from students about this, I thought was also worth quoting. This person said, "I find it hard to believe that this is a piece created for funerals, as it's totally different from the ones I've heard all my life, which happen to be more low," I think he meant low key, he said low toned and slow, with fewer instruments and fewer voices. Which brings us full circle back to the idea that the purpose of the Mass, or at least one of the two purposes of the Mass, is to teach the fundamental lessons of Christianity: salvation, damnation, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, using the music to do this. Okay, so then this brings us back to the question, what is Mozart's view? And what is the view of his contemporaries? What message about life and God and spirituality and heaven was he trying to teach? Here's a painting. This is not a painting from Mozart's time. It's about 2.5 centuries before his. You may have seen it. It's absolutely gruesome. It has a title, "The Triumph of Death." And if you take a minute and snuggle up with this, I guarantee you won't sleep. There are death symbols all over the place, any number of skeletons, butcherings, there's violence, there's blood, there's gore. You can find the 7 deadly sins in one form or another represented throughout this. And this was very much on par with Mozart and his contemporaries' idea of what was going to happen at the end of the world and what might be awaiting him at the end of his life. If we had more time, we could look at letters to Dad and things like that he wrote that gave a little bit more specific view. But this was very much part of his worldview. It wasn't that this was something that this wasn't a story in a far off place. This was an inevitable reality to his generation. And it shows up. We saw in the Dies Irae very early on, "Death and nature will stand aghast when the creature shall rise again to answer before the judge. I groan as one guilty while my countenance blushes for my fault. O spare thy supplicant, O God, my prayers are not worthy, but thou who art good, grant in thy kindness that I may not burn in the everlasting fire." So the fear of everlasting fire is very much a real thing and a very driving force. So to come full circle then, and to take the last step, which if we had, well, we're not doing breakout sessions, you're certainly welcome to discuss among yourselves. The question, what does the study of Mozart's Requiem tell us about ideas of death and the afterlife in the 18th, 19th centuries? We've kind of scratched the surface. What does an examination of those ideas tell us now about our own ideas in the 21st century? And if I learned nothing from Ken Overberg, I learned to end on a question. So I'll stop there, along with a gratuitous picture of my dogs, and stop screen share.
Unmute myself. Well, thank you, Scott. We do have a few questions. Some for Scott, some for either of you. First one's quickie. What's the literal translation of the word requiem?
Rest, eternal rest.
Okay. The rest of that, requiem aeterna,
Yeah.
dona nobis, right? Or dona.
Yeah, exactly. Give them eternal rest.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
While the composer creates the piece and includes the dynamics, how much of the interpretation is the conductor?
Oh, that's a really good question. When you're dealing with a piece that everybody knows, you can't mess with it, because that would be like drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa. You can do subtle tweaks and get away with it. If you do anything too radical, the musicians will rebel and will hate you, because they all have a personal connection to the piece. The audience will hate you, and you will never get hired back again. Not to say that it hasn't been done, but yeah.
Okay, so a lot of...
Right. On the other hand, actually, and the other part of the question is, if you were the first person doing a performance of Mozart's Requiem, you could do whatever you wanted, because there wouldn't be a public expectation to go against.
You know, a lot of our discussions up till now have been, you know, the old God as male, and a lot of Mozart's piece seems to be reinforcing some of the traditional binaries, with God as violent father, people as weeping women.
Yep.
How can we, as the interpreters of this piece, trouble these binaries? What can we do with them?
The only area, when you're pulling something out of the closet that's 300 years old, the only area that you have any margin at all is when you produce an English translation in the printed program for the audience. Okay, so if you've ever dealt with translation, you do have margin, and there are places where you could very easily at least take the rough edges off it. Okay. Because the text is what it is, and because it's in Latin, and Latin is a dead language, you've always got more than one possible interpretation for a single word, and there is certainly plenty of room for in the Latin version of the Roman Catholic Mass for varying interpretations. Right, the only place you would get to express that, if you were doing a performance of this as the conductor, would be in the translation that you chose or created.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this one to Kathy. Can you talk a little bit about why you find art or music to be an important part of your own faith life, and specifically your imagining of God?
Wow. I think for me, wow. I think for me, I really didn't know that I was a visual kind of person, because I don't make art. I'm not an artist. I don't make it. But I find I find that I've always found that I can access history through art much better. And similarly, I can access scripture much better. In fact, right now I'm praying Lent with Vincent van Gogh paintings.
Oh, wow.
And it has been really the most impactful and best prayer practice I've had. So I've just, and I'm surprised all the time,
Tell us more about that.
about, well, I go into this prayer practice and my thing is I know these paintings before I go into them. So there's this tendency for me to think I know it all, there's not going to be any surprises, that I'll just read the scripture. It's like, oh yeah, I got this. I've seen sunflowers, I get it. But when I sit with it, I see something else always. And what I have found with this prayer practice, as it turns out, there's one painting, or actually two paintings every Sunday of Lent. And what I have found is, even if I wanted to walk away thinking, yeah, I got this, every morning during Lent, those paintings show up in my prayer. So it's that thing that I just I think I get closer to God through works by other people, because I feel as though their artists communicate something that I can't reach without them. So I think that's it for me. And I can get the same thing out of music, but I'm more, I'm more visually literate than I am musically. So I can access a lot of those things that I wouldn't access, that I can't, or I would simply walk away otherwise. So that's why art brings me closer to God, I guess.
Janet, could I actually answer that question too?
Absolutely. I was just going to offer to throw it over to you.
Yeah, I happen to have a strong opinion on this one. In a nutshell, words aren't enough. There was a bit of poetry from the 1990s that I held on to. I won't use words again. They don't mean what I meant. They don't say what I said. Just the crust of the meaning with thorns underneath.
Wow.
Yeah, words aren't enough. We need to express something that can't be contained or confined to words.
Well, I think on my clock I see 8:44 and we said 8:45. So I think this is it. This has been great. I've loved it, Kathy and Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you.
Yeah. And as usual, thank you to the planning committee, for getting us organized tonight. That's Donna Park, Linda Finke, Kelly Albany Crosby, Jane Myers, Ashley Thuring, and myself. And also the sponsorships from the ISSJ. Today's presentation was recorded and it'll be made available on the Bellarmine YouTube page. And our next session will be our April 2nd retreat, which is going to be facilitated by Brian Shercliffe at the XU Health United plant building. That's the new one. The retreat will take place from 9 a.m. to noon, and we look forward to seeing you then and exploring a little bit more of everything that we've been talking about so far. Thank you for being with us tonight, and have a great night.
And everyone has to register again. If you registered at the very beginning, you need to register again, right? Right. So there was a link to register again. So please make sure you register with the new link.
Okay.